Passed in 1971, the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is very straightforward. It states that nobody in the United States who meets all the other requirements of citizenship and is of at least 18 years of age shall be denied the right to vote based on their age. In other words, it lowers the minimum federal voting age, again, specifically for federal elections, to age 18, whereas previously it had been 21. For roughly the first century of the United States independence, there weren't a great deal of federal-level voting laws that dictated, for instance, specifically who could vote and what criteria they had to meet. There were plenty of regulations in the Constitution and other federal laws that set out rules for elections, how votes could be counted, and the criteria, including age, people had to meet in order to occupy federal offices. But generally, voting rights, what age or other criteria you had to meet in order to cast a ballot, were left to each state to decide for themselves. So this brings us to the major question of the day. Why pass a constitutional amendment lowering the voting age for federal elections by 3 years in 1971? Well, the answer lies in American conflict in Vietnam, which as of 1970, when this issue really bled over into the outright lawmaking process and people started putting together the foundations of a constitutional amendment, had been going on to some capacity for roughly a generation. While American forces had been present in Southeast Asia, boots on the ground, large amounts of infantry, for a good few years at that point, American military advisors and strategists had been present in Vietnam since the time of President Dwight Eisenhower's administration in the 1950s. And the U.S. remained absolutely committed to quashing what it told its people was a Soviet Union-backed invasion of a democratic regime by local guerrilla fighters for roughly, 12 to 15 years. And in order to support its allies in the region and oppose what it again sold as Soviet aggression, the United States committed large amounts of personnel, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies to a war in Vietnam that spanned years and years, and that made use of a military draft system where people could be called into service, made to go fight in a war against their will if they were of a certain age and were found to be able in body and mind. The minimum age for drafting was 18. The minimum age for voting across most of the country was 21. Do you see where this is going? Friends, as it happened, the fighting in Vietnam continued year after year, far longer than many U.S. policymakers had assumed. And as a result of this, many American casualties would be accrued. These young people had been sent to fight and potentially die in a war that they had no role in or ability to vote against. And that, to many people, was inherently undemocratic, calling for a reduction in the federal voting age to accompany the draft, while a great many people also called for an outright end to the draft and the conflict in Vietnam. And so, in 1970 through 71, the government is increasingly receptive to these protests about the undemocratic way in which the war was being conducted. And President Richard Nixon and many of his allies were desperate to save themselves from cratering approval ratings. So, they passed the 26th Amendment to lower the federal voting age to 18 in an attempt to both save some political face and also respond to a very real need people had been expressing. And it's worth noting, again, this lowered the federal voting age, but with time and a couple of major Supreme Court challenges, eventually this would be a minimum voting age of 18 across the entire United States for virtually all forms of elections.